welcome back to the summit. I don't know about the rest of you, but I needed those 5 minutes to collect myself after such a moving story. I want to now welcome our state forester, Rob Farrell, who identified an important policy topic where we could test out the 6 principles for equitable collaboration to see whether and how these might enrich a policy discussion and ensure that considerations of equity are integrated into the policy recommendations. We chose to do this pilot with 13 alumni of the VNRLI program that you've heard about, who represented a diversity of interests, experience, and skills. Last, we developed a worksheet for them to use so that these 6 elements for equitable collaboration were integrated into their deliberations. You'll now learn from them about how this process worked and their findings and recommendations. I turn this now over to Rob Farrell, our state forester, who is an alumnus of the VNRLI program himself and a long advocate, an inspiring exemplar of a leader who fosters collaborative approaches to policy development. I've been a long admirer of his. So thank you, Rob, for bringing us this topic, and I will hand it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Tanya. Glad to be here. Hello, everyone. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to get to introduce the very first VNRLI Policy Action Working Group. We've still got to work on shortening that title, but I'm really excited about the working group approach. I think it allows us to do 3 things. 1, capitalize on this tremendous cohort of VNRLI alumni across the state. 2, showcase what VNRLI has taught all of us. And 3, help us to address issues that the Commonwealth faces. So I'm really excited about this approach and this concept. Really look forward to doing some good things. And obviously, we're looking at things that we can address through thoughtful and inclusive decision-making, which that can help just about every situation. I was asked to suggest the first topic for the working group, and solar came to mind very quickly because this is an issue that's very important to our farm and forest communities. This is not a question of is solar good or bad, or do we do solar or not? This is a question of where does solar fit on the landscape? Where do solar energy facilities fit on the landscape? And perhaps where do they not fit on the landscape? So that's the question we're looking at. This is a decision that for the most part falls to local governments. So what can we do to help local governments make better decisions about where solar fits and perhaps where doesn't solar fit? And so that's the question that we posed to the Policy Action Working Group to see what we could do to help localities make better decisions about where solar fits on the landscape and how we make sure that solar facilities don't impact our important farm and forest lands across the landscape. So look forward to hearing about the work, and I will turn it over to the work group. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be with you this morning. My name is Michael Skiffington. I'm the Director of Policy and Planning for the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity to participate in this work group. I'd like to thank Secretary Ring and Rob Farrell and the good folks at IEN. Happy 40th birthday, by the way. So you heard Dr. Ellebrock talk a little earlier this morning about VNRLI, and happy 20th birthday to VNRLI. A little bit about the how that group operates in terms of the makeup of the participants who come from all across the Commonwealth every year. And if we can go to the slide presentation, thought we would start off by talking a little bit about who is amongst the members of this Policy Action Work Group. And as you'll see on this slide, and the next one, that it is a diverse group of state, local governments, nonprofits, and private industry. Would like to give a shout out to Kim Hodge, who I'm honored to serve as co-chair with on this. And if we go to the next slide, you see the second half of the participants on the work group, and it was a joy to me to be able to collaborate again with my brothers and sisters from the class of 2018, and hello to all those who might be out there from that class watching. So let's go to the next slide, please. So as Rob talked about, this is sort of the task that we were given at the for the policy group, and as if you've been following the energy policy landscape situation in the Commonwealth, it has changed considerably in the past 2 years with the passage of the Virginia Clean Economy Act and other energy-related legislation. So we were asked to help the Commonwealth create a path for solar that minimizes the impact of land use and solar resources. And the three questions, as you can see there, that we were grappling with to come up with some of the recommendations that we'll be talking about here shortly. And that is how can the state balance renewable energy development with impacts on working lands, and taking into account also the potential impact on land use and natural resources of the Commonwealth, and what policies could we recommend to minimize these impacts. So you've heard a little bit about the who and the what and the why. And to talk a little bit about the how we did our group, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague over on the Eastern Shore, Hallie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Mike. I am happy to be here and to be speaking from the governor's home part of the state. So I want to tell you a little bit about the method that we used on the process. If we could go to the next slide, that would be wonderful. Perfect. So as you've heard this morning, we worked with the Equitable Collaboration Framework, and you can see that framework here, which many have done a great job of introducing today. An equitable collaboration is a type of public deliberation that addresses community spaces where power, historical trauma, and ongoing disparities are at stake. And one of the disparities that we noticed was actually the rural-urban identities, as well as the racial, ethnic, religious, class, gender, or other lines of identity. So we were working with this framework, and if you want to hear more about the framework or learn more about it, Tanya introduced the website earlier, and that's transformingcommunityspaces.org. So there's more on that there. And if you'll jump to the next slide. So we started with a worksheet that IEN provided with us to guide us through this equitable collaboration process. And our first step in the worksheet was to actually fill out a stakeholder table, which you have an example of here on the slide. The table really helped us figure out our process and also what subject matter experts we would consult with. And this is just an example of how we did that, when we started with an interest, and then we had a set of stakeholders and then identified what is at stake for those stakeholders and within that interest. And we did positives and negatives. So you can kind of see an example of that where we have a couple of negatives and a couple of positives. So we did this for agriculture, air quality. We looked at aviation and biodiversity, clean energy, employment, economy. We talked about forestry, recreation, water quality, wildlife habitat. We went through a lot of different interests as we went through this table. Next slide, please. So that helped us with our process. As I said, it helped us decide who we were going to consult with. We had 5 meetings. These started in December and ended just like a week or so ago. So there were 5 from December to February. And we had additional subgroup meetings too, including environmental justice, natural resource, and one that was focused on a landowner focus. At our first meeting, we had the honor of hearing from our state forester, our Secretary of Ag and Forestry, as well as a senior conservation scientist from the Nature Conservancy. In our second meeting, we heard from a local government panel, which included a county administrator, a regional planner, and a director of planning and land use. In our third meeting, we had a solar development panel, which included industry representatives. And at our fourth meeting, we had a representative from the Department of Mines and Minerals and Energy. The subgroups also had subject matter experts chime in. And our environmental justice subgroup heard from Dominion Energy and their environmental justice staff, We also heard from a gentleman affiliated with the solar facility site in Essex County and a director of zoning and planning. The Natural Resources Group had input from the Southern Environmental Law Center. We'll go to the next slide and I will hand it over to Janae Provost-White.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Janae Prevost-White. I work for the town of Dumfries. I'm going to briefly just go through what the Environmental Justice Group came up with and how we came to those recommendations for the main group. Over the course of several weeks, we met to determine what environmental justice impacts solar siting could have on property owners. We began by having a sort of debriefing meeting from the first 3 guest speakers that Hallie just mentioned from the second group meeting to the solar siting group. It was Brian Barnes, Director of Planning at Lancaster County, John Bateman, Regional Planner, Northern Neck Planning District Commission, and Scott Simpson from Halifax County Administrator. And their comments about solar siting and how it had a big impact on the locality. The group was surprised to learn that a big portion of solar siting was the lack of internal instruction or guidance and policy to help navigate the process and the demand on resources on a small county to inspect and enforce these projects. Many in the group understood that aspects of enforcement of environmental policy is done consistently through adopting clear and specific guidance documents that both localities and developers can follow to ensure fair and consistent development. We tried to use a SWOT analysis, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats approach to understand how solar siting impacted EJ communities. But we quickly abandoned that approach and tried mostly to stick to completing the questions in the worksheet outlined for us, outlined in the group. Using our guest speakers, we could obtain to clarify some questions we had about solar siting processes by talking about articles and experiences of those in the group. Amelia Boshin, of our subgroup, supervisor over the environmental regulations for Dominion Energy, asked a colleague, Catherine McCormick, who is the lead consultant within the Dominion Corporate Environment Group for EJ, and also part of the government's Environmental Justice, Council on Environmental Justice. She shared her experience on what EJ-related regulatory requirements solar development projects are subject to currently, and her thoughts on any existing gaps, potential improvements for what solar developers should be incorporated into siting. So the biggest takeaway from our meeting with Ms. McCormick was the lack of identification of environmental groups across the Commonwealth. When we asked Katie about what she thought would be the biggest impact, she identified a GIS mapping tool for all of the environmental justice groups in every jurisdiction. The data could actually start at the state level, would be better quality data if each locality could identify those groups more accurately to the state. The way the process goes now, each time a new project is proposed, in a new location, the developer must start from scratch to determine the groups, their history, their past transgressions, etc. Having a database would help developers get ahead of reaching out to those groups prior to getting far into the project. We further discussed protection of property rights, job loss, cultural heritage loss, and long-term impacts to the land, lack of education and the lack of resources to landowners, localities, and developers have to navigate the process. We began to see many overlapping themes between EJ policy and the technical subgroups. The group saw a need for better education for EJ groups before the process gets started. The irony is that those that are impacted most from environmental justice understand the least about it, or at least know the resources they have to use to speak against it. The subgroup recognized the need for the creation of advocacy at the state level and the need for transparency from developers from the outset about the process and the financial incomes of solar siting. The group also discussed an article in the Journal of Environmental Sustainability Law on environmental justice and sustainability development. The big takeaway from that environment was renewable energy jobs should go back to the disadvantaged communities. From this, we concluded that mitigation or offsets should be a requirement of solar siting projects on impacted EJ communities, and the best approach would be for better land use and zoning regulations to guide the process to create inclusion and dialogue from the beginning of the process. Mr. Hill, who was not present, was our second speaker, answered some questions about a solar farm that his group, the Southside Rappahannock Baptist Association, created to offset the land use that the group owned to create a revenue stream. This project was successful, but it wound up being in an enforcement process because there was a lack of erosion and sediment controls on the project, which caused some impairments to the local stream. So based on that, this prompted the subgroup to question the ability of small localities to handle regulatory enforcements of large solar projects. This is an issue we heard from many discussions we had both in the subgroups and the main groups. This discussion led us to call on our last contributor to the group, Daria Christian, the executive director for the Friends of the Rappahannock, working on the technical subgroup, who had firsthand experience about this particular site and the runoff issue, leading to us discussing the need to improve not only land use policy and regulations, but also improvement to the current Virginia DEQ erosion and sediment control handbook. Having tighter and improved best management practices and technology will increase the likelihood of large projects deteriorating from lack of inspection and maintenance and creating damaging impacts to water quality. Many of the final recommendations overlap in many areas as the other subgroups. Additionally, should the state create policy to require creation of these tools, they will not only benefit solar siting projects, but other development projects with the potential to create a better, more sensitive, inclusive, and thoughtful product, benefiting both the locality and the landowners. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over.
All right, Janae, thank you so much. And thank you to you and Frank Johnson for your work in co-chairing the EJ work group. It's definitely appreciated. So now, having set the stage, we're going to talk a little bit about the recommendations that the Policy Action Work Group has come up with, starting with the first one on this slide right here. To develop a comprehensive toolbox for localities and stakeholders. One of the things we heard from our meetings is that certain localities need assistance in terms of handling the ever-increasing number of applications they're getting for solar development in their jurisdictions. And one element of this toolbox should be a GIS mapping tool that has the layers that you see there. Now, this is by no means an all-inclusive list, but we just wanted to hit the highlights of some of the things that might be helpful, including existing transmission infrastructure. Obviously, developers like to be as close to that infrastructure as they can when they're looking at potential new projects. A mapping layer for previously developed project sites, brownfields, abandoned and orphaned mine land, and also agriculture and forest lands that are marginalized or otherwise not fully productive. And finally, going back to something Janae mentioned, a mapping layer that deals with or properly reflects EJ communities. On the next slide here, we've got another example of an element of the toolbox, and that is best management practices for localities to review. And some of the topics that the group felt were important includes best practices with respect to decommissioning, soil health, habitat protection, and agrivoltaics and pollinators. If we could go to the next slide, please. Additionally, templates for local governments to start from and use and be able to tailor to their own needs. And again, going back to what Janae discussed, these templates, it's very important that these templates reflect adequate emphasis on equity and environmental justice issues with respect to model ordinances, siting agreements. That was a tool that was created in last year's General Assembly for solar projects in opportunity zones in the Commonwealth, and legislation that has recently passed in this session will extend that not only statewide, but also to include battery storage systems as well. Conditional special use permits, outreach and education strategies, including EJ principles that ideally would bring folks together early in the process to get their input and so that they feel heard. And finally, maintenance agreements and cost benefit tools. Some of these things are currently in place with respect to the SolSmart certification that DMME runs with assistance from UVA, and also the recently released Sol Tax model that gives localities a tool to determine which of the available financing mechanisms would be best suited as to how a solar project could be financed in terms of revenue. Other recommendations the group came up with stormwater and E&S controls. Those who know on the group who know far more about this than me, which was just about everyone, noted that increasing effects of climate change are not really reflected in the current regulations for stormwater and E&S. So that is something that we think should be taken a look at by a technical advisory committee consisting of statewide experts in these areas to look at that, and also recommend updates to the manual that may be utility or specific to utility scale solar site development. And on the next slide, you'll see another recommendation that the Commonwealth should adapt policies to incentivize the use of previously developed project sites or other sites that we talked about earlier, and a stakeholder group that could assist with identifying potential funding opportunities in addition to other recommendations we felt was pretty important to get this recommendation off of the ground. And finally, with respect to EJ, again, going back to some of Janae's remarks, we want to get a recommendation in place that moves the ball forward with respect to having EJ communities having a seat at the table from the very beginning of the process all the way through decommissioning. And these are some of the ways on those bullet points there that you can see that the group thought might be good ways to do that. Having EJ communities mapped properly, having their input reflected in zoning and comprehensive plans, having EJ histories recorded and considered during the siting process, and collaborating with the other existing EJ groups, the council and the interagency working group, and the newly forming Office of DEQ, and practices to inform the community to mitigate negative impacts, and other assistance to EJ communities. So those are a very high level view of our recommendations. And I will turn it back over to Tanya.
Okay, that is fantastic. And big thanks to Rob Farrell again for giving us this difficult topic to test out equitable collaboration. And a big thank you to Michael and Hallie and Janae and the entire Policy Action Working Group for their willingness to participate in this pilot and for such a thoughtful and rich set of findings and recommendations. I feel like we really should be spending the entire morning on this to give it justice. I think we've just had a glimpse of what they've discussed and the thoughtfulness that they've approached it with. So just many thanks and kudos to you for this work. We will make their PowerPoint available through the Summit website, and that will be part of the Summit proceedings. So thank you. We're about ready to enter the third part of our morning, where we are excited to invite you, all of you, to join and contribute to discussions around specific policies that could be helpful at the state level to advance equitable collaboration. Our goal for these policy discussions is to hear your ideas and suggestions around 6 very specific issues that have been identified by the administration. The 7th room is more broadly focused, where you can share resources and ideas for other policy gaps and needs. There will be 2 rounds. They will be, I'm looking at the clock right now, I think each round will be about between 40 to 45 minutes each for each round. When you arrive in the room, your facilitators will orient you to the process that they'll be guiding you through. Groups 1 through 6 will have subject matter experts with you who can also provide background and answer questions. The facilitators will give you a link to a Google worksheet where you'll be able to directly type into it and contribute your suggestions. Now, for those of you who may not be able to access this worksheet, you can always add your comments into the chat box, and the team will make sure they're recorded in the worksheet, or you can also mention them verbally and somebody will get them down for you. So also the discussions will be recorded, but it's important for you to know that for this particular part of the summit, they will not be shared with the public, so that we're trying to create a space where all ideas are welcome without people feeling that they're going to later have a commitment to those ideas. So the recordings are really only for our internal use to help us with the notes. I want to be clear that the discussions today are not about creating recommendations. We're not trying to create consensus here. Today is a kind of brainstorming, if you will, an opportunity to make suggestions and also to see what ideas rise to the top through a process where you can identify ideas that you and your organization would support. At the end of today, we'll be gathering these ideas together and we'll transmit them to the administration. So then what? What's going to happen with all of this? When we submit the work from today, the intent is for a small group of cabinet members to review the ideas and determine appropriate next steps for the administration. We anticipate the review will likely take the next 2 months, and that we'll be able to share with all of you what decisions have been made about the next steps by the end of April. There are a wide range of possible options for action that may be considered by the governor's administration, and these include everything from an executive order and/or directives, encouraging an agency to undertake a study or an action, to developing a legislative initiative for the 2022 General Assembly, or including something in the governor's proposed budget for the next biennium, or to scale up or even end an action, program, or policy. So that's the range of possibilities that they might be considering. A few last notes. When you choose a policy discussion to join, please know you are not fixed or stuck in that room. You can move yourself at any time to another policy discussion. So you're empowered to move yourself anytime. And you also can stay in the same topic for both rounds if you desire. Last, if you have any technical issues, if you're not able to move yourself into the policy discussion you want to go to, return to the platform homepage and click on support at the bottom of the page. And they'll be there and they will help you get to the room where you want to go. So now I invite you to find the policy discussion that most interests you and move yourself to that room. There will be a break let me just redo this break here, it's 10:35, so let's give it 40 minutes and we'll have a break in 40 minutes. And at that point, you can either stay in the same room or move yourself to another room. And we'll see you all back here in the main room at 12 noon for a short wrap up when when you are done and your room is closed, go back to the main event platform and simply click on wrap up session, and you'll be back with us for the brief wrap up. Okay, with that, have fun, enjoy the policy discussions, and we'll see you back here in a little bit. Thank you all.